The end of the Great War promised hope for a nation, but prohibition and oppression eroded the core of the Union. The new nations turned to the sky, ushering in a new era of commerce. And with it, sky piracy was born. This is a world on fire. This is the world of Crimson Skies.
Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. The last few videos have been a little too down to earth lately, so let's shake things up with the high-flying adventure that is Crimson Skies High Road to Revenge. Crimson Skies is one of the few games that I did play as a child, and was radically different from many of the other flight sims that existed at that time. Most games that were trying to do aerial combat were either focusing on modern-day planes or space, but instead of doing any of that, this game relied on an alternate universe where the skies had become the primary means of travel. Also, let's have a variety of different circumstances shatter the United States into multiple territories in order to further encourage aerial travel once the railroads start crossing into now enemy territory. And even if that description sounds dismissive, it's a scenario that does lend itself to a lot of really fun ideas. And I have a lot of fond memories of playing the game myself and of watching the rest of my family enjoy it too. However, it wasn't until recently that we received the sequel, and more importantly a means of playing it, so I went into it with high hopes of having a grand old time once again. Before we get started though, there's one quick thing I want to note. As it turns out, emulating Xbox games is surprisingly hard, and as a result, there might be some hiccups with the video quality. Instead of using an emulator, I used the streaming feature on my family's Xbox One so that I could run recording software through my main computer, which is a really roundabout means of getting footage, but seemed like the best option at the time. Unfortunately, it means I got screen tearing from my recording software due to how I set it up, and occasional hiccups with my Wi-Fi throwing things off as well. Most of it's in good shape, but if there's any point where things look off, that's why. Besides that though, the game does look surprisingly good. I don't normally lead reviews with the look and feel of a game, but since that's what helped it stand out from the pack, it seems too important to not mention right off the bat. The plane designs look really nice, and the UI is solid enough to where it was fairly easy to interact with. The environments are a little basic, but given the variety that's on display, I can't fault it too much. Between the mountains, desert plains, islands, and big cityscapes you find yourself in, every area has its own feel to it that's really nice to explore and look at. When it comes to the story, you are Nathan Zachary, a sweet-talking badass sky pirate who finds himself in all kinds of mayhem as a result of poor decisions and a zealous pursuit of adventure. After regaining a sense of normalcy due to some self-inflicted chicanery, a friend of his is killed in relation to a destructive weapon which he had the plans to construct. Fortunately, Nathan had taken the plans from the good doctor, and now has a goal to kickstart the rest of the game, i.e. chasing his friend's murderer across the Americas for some good old-fashioned revenge. For the most part, the plot acts as a springboard for the gameplay to take center stage, but despite the simple premise, I do like it. There's only a surface-level look at a lot of the places we visit, but there's still a decent amount of personality put into both Nathan and the other characters you come across. There's also an interesting moral gray area that you're constantly stewing in, as while you're an infamous sky pirate, you often find yourself working with law enforcement, or at least against groups who are far more malicious than you. That, combined with Nathan's line of work being precarious enough as it is, leads to a circumstance where it's not always obvious where the plot is going or whom you can trust, because at any moment some new information will come up that will cause someone to change their tune, sparking all sorts of mayhem along the way. However, while it's a good setup, I do have a couple of problems with it. The first is more of a nitpick than anything else, but personally, I miss Nathan's old voice. In the original, that voice carried the game in a time when the only reference we had for the character was spoken word and a few still images. It was commanding, charming, and conveyed a sense of class and dignity, the spitting and romantic image of a man living life on the edge. In other words, an excellent excuse for me to go full high school literature numbskull who just discovered the dictionary. Here though, the voice is somewhat similar, but it's a lot, for lack of a better word, flatter than before. There doesn't seem to be as much energy or command behind it, which takes some of the impact out of what could have been amazing scenes. Granted, it's still serviceable and he does get a few good one-liners here and there, but it just doesn't feel like it has the same weight as before. The second point is less of a nitpick though, because it has to do with the theme, or more accurately how it's being used. Instead of still images and a primary reliance on voice for, well, everything, now they've introduced full-blown cutscenes into the mix, which do work fairly well, but in some ways introduce a bit of a tonal clash. The actual character models look good enough, even by today's standards, but everything feels just a little too clean. Say what you will about the limitations for the original cutscenes, but they conveyed more of a sense of the time, and are partially missed as a result. And I know that still sounds like a nitpick, but this also bleeds over into the gameplay as well. In order to improve your planes, you are given upgrade tokens after certain missions, and can also find them scattered throughout the regions you visit. To again draw comparisons to the original, there was a similar idea there as well, where you were rewarded for so-called danger stunts, such as moving through narrow passageways, under bridges, and so on and so forth. In this case, it has the advantage of being clearer as to where you need to go for the reward, but also doesn't mesh as well with the tone that's being presented. Combine that with matters that will be further discussed in the gameplay section, and the game ends up feeling like an arcadey version of the original rather than a continuation of it. And that arcadey feel is really hammered home when you get into some of the vehicle designs. By my understanding of the world, it's one that has taken a very different direction in terms of technology, but is still fairly analogous with the 1930s and 40s. That means when you run into something that looks like this, my suspension of disbelief is officially gone. I can buy an alternate history where the United States fragmented. I can buy technology moving in a different direction. But I can't buy that technology accelerating to the point where they can build a spider-like walker into the front of a Zeppelin that's able to walk around without issue over difficult terrain when it's only been in the last few years that we're even close to doing that on a smaller scale. That, for me, was the bridge too far, and made everything else I've talked about stand out a lot more, and not in a good way. That being said, there is one part that absolutely nails the aesthetic and theme, and that's the audio design. The static in the radio transmissions is a really nice touch, and every weapon sounds like something that would exist at the time, while also being distinct enough from each other to where I know it's being thrown at me. The music especially is really nice. As while it can be a little overzealous, it adds a decent amount of tension to the combat in and of itself, and is nice to listen to on top of that. Speaking of combat, that's another matter that's handled well, though with some caveats attached to it. Within the game itself, there will be times when you're free to explore the current region, allowing you to participate in various missions and events for fame and fortune, or at least the fortune part. After all, favors don't come cheap, and neither do the one-time upgrades for your planes, which means you've got a lot that you can and probably should do before continuing with the main story. The missions themselves range from destroying a given set of targets, to races, to gathering objects for one reason or another, to protecting a given target, and so on and so forth. These missions can generally be broken down into either timed events where you gotta go fast, or combat missions where you have to face down whichever force is giving you grief this time around. Naturally, you'll want to do as many of these missions as you can, as beyond just lining your pockets and liberating new planes for your arsenal, it also gives you an opportunity to look for those upgrade tokens along the way. This is especially important because you won't have enough tokens to upgrade every plane you can find, so you better be careful as to how you spend them. With the in-game economy, I was never at a loss for money since that I was doing every mission, and even though I couldn't upgrade every ship, it wasn't a detail that really bothered me due to matters that I'll get into later. What did bother me was how simplistic the upgrade system is, because in this game all you do is spend a bit of money and your scant upgrade tokens and you're done with it for the remainder of the game. In theory there's nothing wrong with that, but because I played the original, I can say firsthand that it's a shockingly basic setup compared to the amount of customization you used to have. If you can think of something you'd want to tamper with on a plane, from the engines to the weapons to even the paint job, you can mess with it to your liking. In that regard, the planes you found weren't just trophies in and of themselves, but something you made your own, that you had a personal hand in crafting. And while the current system is easier to understand and work with given the game length, the sense of progression seems like it was needlessly simplified. Thankfully, while the upgrade system isn't as solid this time around, the process of looking around, finding every nook and cranny within the relatively open areas does kinda make up for it. Since that a lot of tokens are tucked away in tight corners, it encourages you to both improve your flying and be creative as to where you can go. It also gives a point of reference from which most events in the game occur, so that even when your travels eventually take you elsewhere, you have a better sense of where you are and where you're going. When it comes to the combat itself, it's fairly simple. Each plane is a primary fire with infinite ammo bound to the right trigger, a limited fire secondary of some kind, which range from a shotgun blast to a single rocket to a more powerful machine gun burst. This weaponry is where a lot of the variety within the ships came from, and gave each one a small niche that they could call their own beyond just their look and back-end statistics. For instance, the plane with the shotgun blast is a more agile fighter, meaning it was much easier to get behind opponents and volunteer them for your disappearing plane trick. Another plane could fire multiple rockets at once, which was really useful whenever I had a Zeppelin that would look better at the bottom of the ocean. The main problem with the ship variety is the fact that, with one exception, each plane is designed to be at least serviceable at everything, and because you can't just swap out planes in your home Zeppelin during a mission, that meant after a while I just stuck to the first plane you're given due to it being consistently reliable. There were other times where I had to fly a different plane, especially if I was commandeering it, but generally I wouldn't use them much outside of the mission they were stolen in, except for maybe one or two other sorties if I was feeling adventurous. Fortunately, they did find a way to keep variety in what you're doing by giving you opportunities to man the anti-air guns, which despite the notoriety that turret sections have nowadays, actually did add a decent amount. There were enough subtle differences with the different guns' fire rate and feeling of impact, and the sections that required them occurred at just the right frequency to be a nice little diversion without being unwelcome. And honestly, that variety was needed because when it comes to the core gameplay loop, it does boil down to fairly simple controls. I can't harp on this too much since there's only so many buttons on a controller compared to this ancient piece of technology, but it did take me some getting used to regardless. Since that you're flying planes, you're constantly on the move, which means instead of using the left analog for forward movement, it's used for directional movement, with two buttons that allow you to slow down or speed up. These were especially useful because your speed was inversely proportional to your maneuverability, adding a small thing to keep track of that feels natural within the context of the game. The right analog stick isn't neglected here either, as you can use it to either tilt in a given direction or when combined with the left analog, can be used to pull off predetermined maneuvers. Said maneuvers are typically focused around avoiding fire, with the most useful one allowing you to quickly turn around without hitting the brakes. It's tempting to complain about how it's a simpler system, but given that it's a control scheme that I'm unfamiliar with, I'm not sure how much I can complain about it when I can't seem to line up a good shot anyway. In general, it works about as well as it needs to, and doesn't really do much more than that. It's a little flaky when it comes to the gyrocopter since that's the one craft that can remain stationary, but given that it's there more for the sake of variety rather than as competition for the other aircraft, I again can't complain about it too much. However, I do have one major issue with the game that I feel needlessly drags it down, and that's the fact that it seems to handle me with kitty gloves. Granted, I'm bad at the game, so I only have so much room to complain, but it's because I'm bad at it that I could say with 100% certainty that it gave me way more room to maneuver than it should. Fatal crashes happen a lot less often, the enemy AI is wildly inconsistent to a degree where I could usually get away with aerial jousting rather than clever maneuvering, and Zeppelins aren't nearly as threatening this time around, which takes away much of the impact of bringing one down. But what really takes the stakes away from combat is the fact that there was almost always a way to mitigate or nullify damage. Some of these cases made sense, as when you're stealing an enemy plane, you would expect it to have full health and ammo. And the fact that you're changing your plane mid-battle could force you on back heel a little bit as you readjust to something new. What can't be forgiven are the repair stations, where for a negligible amount of cash, you can get a full rearm and repair within seconds, effectively taking away much of the challenge behind virtually every fight the game has. As a result, it no longer became a matter of clever maneuvering, but rather a matter of attrition, wearing them down and constantly dragging the fight for longer than it otherwise would be, simply because you can afford to be bullheaded because there's always a way to mitigate the damage you've taken. Thankfully, these don't show up in every circumstance, but given that they show up in most of them, there were very few times that I was ever shot down, despite being bad at the game. And yeah, in case it isn't obvious yet, I'm really torn as to whether I should recommend this. On one hand, the pacing is well done, the core gameplay is pretty fun, and the setting and theme are a lot of fun to explore. On the other hand, this is also a game that I can unironically say was dumbed down for console peasants by making it less complex, more arcadey, and with enough ways to mitigate trouble to where I seldom, if ever, had a reason to get good. I recognize that a game should be able to stand on its own merit, especially given the different circumstances between this game's release and its original, but as someone who played that original when he was young, it's a comparison that I simply can't ignore, and if I didn't wear it on my sleeve for this review, my opinion wouldn't make sense. The reality is that I went into this hoping for what I enjoyed before, and while there were elements of it that I really liked, it also felt hollow because of what I know the franchise is capable of. So in the end, my recommendation comes down to this. Are you willing to look past the simpler setup that comes with console adaptations of the day in order to enjoy a high-flying adventure with Sky Pirates? For most people, I think the theme and core gameplay loop will be enough to hold your attention, but if you played the first one and haven't gotten around to the sequel, just don't go into it expecting everything to be as you remembered. If you're interested, the Xbox One has set up backwards compatibility for it, which means the disc I had worked just fine with it, but if you don't have an Xbox, then, well, I can't officially recommend the alternative, so good luck trying to emulate it. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a weekly basis. And since I feel the need to say it once again, I do apologize to anyone who thought I should have eased off the comparisons to the original. But since my opinion was greatly influenced by the original, it didn't feel right to neglect it. Fortunately for me, the next sequel that I'm planning on covering is one that's so radically different from the original that those comparisons will be non-existent. Either way, it's going to be a while before that one is ready, so I'd better get back to chipping away at it, and we'll see you all later.